Hello there, it's Neil Fight here from SUNY Fredonia with another video lecture. This is going to be the first of two videos on the problem of free will and the ideas of free will and moral responsibility, which I'll talk about in this one, along with one theoretical perspective that denies that we have freedom of the will, that we have the kind of control necessary to do things freely. And in the second video, I'll talk about various perspectives that accept the idea that we sometimes act freely, accept the idea of free will. Let's get started with a couple of examples. Think about this one. A woman named Hilda, she notices someone else's wallet on the sidewalk. She's walking down the street, there's a wallet there. Nobody's around. It's got a driver's license, credit cards, cash, and she deliberates about what to do, and maybe she's thinking about three things she could do. She could return it with minimal effort. Maybe she notices that the address on the driver's license is quite close to where she lives. Or, perhaps second, she could return it after taking some or all of the cash that's in it. Or third, she could just leave it where it is, maybe after taking some cash. And let's finish out the story. Let's suppose that she decides to take the cash and leave the wallet just where she found it. Okay, and she performs this action. This is exactly what she does. Seems like she acted freely. She's morally responsible for having stolen the cash. Contrast that with a second example. I'll have you as the subject here. Suppose you're kidnapped and forced to commit several crimes. In particular, first, the kidnapper forces your fingers to grab a loaf of bread. Can you imagine that? Second, afterwards, you're hypnotized into mugging someone late at night. Little typo there, late at night. Whether we're super realists about hypnosis, let's suppose that you're hypnotized, you come under someone else's control, this person hypnotizes you into mugging someone late at night, and then you're pushed. You squash a young girl's dollhouse after being pushed into it. I hope you'll agree with me. In the first example, Hilda seems to act freely. That is, she seems to act of her own free will. But in this example, you do not. Okay? It seems like you don't freely steal the loaf of bread. You don't freely mug someone. You don't mug someone of your own free will. You don't break the girl's dollhouse of your own free will. And by the way, contemporary philosophers speak mostly of acting freely, or not acting freely, rather than this other phrase, which is maybe more popular in common usage, to do something of your own free will. So whenever I say act freely, if you're more comfortable with the phrase act of your own free will, you could think of it in those terms. The free will and determinism problem in philosophy is an ancient problem. And here's one way of looking at what the problem is. Okay? It seems that we're morally responsible agents. So we have the power to act freely. This involves some kind of control over our actions, and we'll think about just what that control might amount to as we go along. But if the actions that we perform, if these are all caused by past events, then it seems we don't act freely, and we're not morally responsible. Because if you are caused to behave in the way that you behave, you had to do that. You couldn't have done anything else instead. It seems like as a result, you're not responsible for what you did. You didn't act freely. However, if the actions that we perform are uncaused, it seems we are not responsible for them. It seems like they're random or a matter of chance. They just happened. Nobody and nothing is responsible for them, and we didn't do them freely. So it seems hard to make room for that first claim up there that we're morally responsible agents. It seems like being caused to act in the way we act and not being caused to act in the way we act both kind of conflict with the idea that we're morally responsible agents. So solving the problem here will be probably diving into one of these three claims up on top more critically. what does it mean to say that someone is a morally responsible agent or someone is morally responsible for something? Let's have sort of a rough definition. Let's say that someone is morally responsible for an action when he or she is blameworthy or praiseworthy for performing that action. So, for example, seems pretty clear that Hilda is blameworthy for stealing someone else's money in that wallet example. Someone who makes a large donation to charity, on the opposite hand, might be praiseworthy for that action. And being blameworthy is different from being blamed, right? You can be blamed for something without being blameworthy. If someone thinks you did something that you didn't really do, they might blame you, but you're not blameworthy. And vice versa. You might be blameworthy without being blamed. Hilda might get away with that crime. She's still blameworthy, but nobody might ever blame her. Okay? And a very plausible thought is that you're morally responsible for doing something only if you do it freely. Now, so if you don't act freely, you're not morally responsible for what you've done. And in one of our very short readings, here's that 1,000-word philosophy website, and this free will and moral responsibility article, the author Chelsea Haramia says she's thinking about an example, various situations in which people might steal something. And if someone is a genuine kleptomaniac who really can't control her stealing behavior, it seems like this person is not blameworthy for stealing. We might be skeptical and think, oh, they're just faking this mental illness. But if they're really a kleptomaniac, it seems like we shouldn't blame them. And she says, why shouldn't we blame the kleptomaniac? That is to say, how are we justified in holding the kleptomaniac morally responsible? One good reason not to blame the kleptomaniac is that she cannot help her behavior. She possesses a psychological problem that is out of her control. So the idea is we ought not to blame her because she didn't act freely if she's really a kleptomaniac. So this is a plausible thought, that if you're morally responsible for something only if you do it freely. If you're not stealing freely, you're not morally responsible for stealing. And of course, the criminal insanity defense kind of incorporates this idea in the legal context. Here's a similar way to kind of introduce the problem of free will. Let's call this very short, sweet principle the free will principle. All it says is people sometimes act freely. It does not say that everything we do is a free action. Sometimes. We sometimes act freely. The extent of our freedom might be a controversial matter. If one person acted freely just once, this principle would be true. We might think of another principle that's often called determinism. I'm going to state determinism like this. Every event is caused by another event or events. So in other words, for everything that happens, there's something or some things before it that make it happen. Okay? And since a cause is just this thing, it's an event or group of events that makes another event happen, this version of determinism implies another very common formulation of determinism, that given the past and the laws of nature, what happens in the future is fixed or determined. In this other article that I kind of linked to for our reading this week, Free Will and Free Choice, the author there, Jonah Nagashima, has a little thing about determinism. He says, determinism is the view that every event is necessitated by prior events. Current and future events must happen as they happen. Okay, so another way to think about the problem of free will is that these principles individually seem quite plausible. On the other hand, it seems that there's a tension and incompatibility between them. So, if you did the reading, you read about a perspective called Incompatibilism. It's a kind of a general perspective that's shared by people who disagree about more specific matters. But the idea here is the free will principle is incompatible with determinism. They can't both be true. So in other words, if the world is deterministic, nobody ever acts freely. And vice versa. If people do sometimes act freely, then the world must not be deterministic. Determinism must be false. There's a little argument for this perspective that I would like to share with you, and I'm going to come back to it sort of at the very end of this pair of lectures on free will. So here's the argument. If determinism is true, we can't do anything other than what we actually do. Okay, so if determinism is true, then your actions are caused. Your actions are caused by previous events. But these causes of your actions are also caused, and so on, and so on, and so on. So it seems like given that certain events occurred way back even before you were born, someone with full knowledge could have predicted exactly what you would do. You can't do anything other than what you actually do. But if that's the case, if we can't do anything other than what we actually do, nobody ever acts freely. The idea, the explanation for premise 2 is that acting freely requires the ability to do something other than what you actually do. So if you can't do anything other, nobody ever acts freely. In some sense, if behaving in the way that you behave was the only possible way that you could have behaved, you didn't act freely. And premise 1 here says, if one thing, then another. Determinism leads to can't do anything other. And premise 2 says, well, can't do anything other leads to no freedom. And so the conclusion is just going to link determinism with no freedom. So therefore, if determinism is true, then nobody ever acts freely. Nobody ever acts freely is equivalent to saying that the free will principle is false. Okay, this is a valid argument. Sometimes this form is called hypothetical syllogism. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. And notice that the conclusion here is another way of saying incompatibilism, right? If determinism is true, then the free will principle must be false. They can't both be true. I think that's an interesting argument. There are a lot of people who disagree about specifics, but who accept incompatibilism. There are other philosophers who reject it, who I'm going to talk about more in the next video lecture. So this is just a little bit of a preview that might be helpful. And maybe there are other views. I don't claim that this lists every single theoretical possibility, but various views on free will, philosophical views on free will, might be classified as incompatibilist views, the idea that acting freely is incompatible with determinism, or compatibilist views. Okay, that might maybe sound strange to you, I don't know, but we're going to talk about those next time. Incompatibilist views, if you follow the left side of the chart down, we're going to divide those into hard determinism and libertarian views. And the libertarianism here is not a political libertarianism, it's a metaphysical view, which accepts incompatibilism but says that we do act freely. Okay, what we're going to talk about today is just this. Okay, we're going to talk about the incompatibilist view known as hard determinism for the rest of this little video. Hard determinism is going to deny free will, and all of the other theories, all the other perspectives are going to accept that we sometimes act freely, accept free will. And by the end of these two videos, and the reading and the slides, I'm hoping that you will start kind of thinking seriously about this issue. I think it's a really interesting kind of issue to think about. Still being explored voluminously by philosophers today. Why might we think that determinism is true? Again, remember, determinism is the idea that every event is caused to happen by a prior event or events, and as a result, the present state of the universe is, in some sense, fixed, or the necessary consequence of the past states of the universe, given the laws of nature. Well, it does seem plausible that every event must have a cause, and also that causes make their effects happen. If a bridge collapses, and a team is appointed to investigate why the bridge collapsed, if they spent months and months and millions of dollars and they came up with the answer, well, just random, nothing caused it, we would be deeply skeptical of that, right? We would think, oh, the collapse of the bridge must have a cause. It's kind of what determinism says. Every event must have a cause. Moreover, in much of nature, the future seems determined by the past. We could predict when the next full moon is, blah, blah, blah. And you might think our inability to predict everything is really just the result of our ignorance, right? We just don't have full information. If we had full information, we could predict things much, much, much more accurately than we actually are able to do. So many Scientists and philosophers of science have thought that determinism should be a guiding principle of the sciences. Okay, we will revisit this from time to time as we go along. Hard determinism is the view that determinism is true, so hard determinists accept determinism, and they think that the argument for incompatibilism is sound. So, and they agree that if hard determinism is true, then nobody ever acts freely. Later on, next video, I'm going to talk about soft determinism. And again, maybe this probably seems strange to some of you, but soft determinism is the idea that determinism is true, but we still act freely in the ordinary sense of that phrase. Okay, but today, let's take a gander at hard determinism. So the theory, as I'm going to present it to you, makes two claims. Claim A says determinism is true, and so nobody ever acts freely. So this is the idea, determinism is asserted to be true, and as a result, the argument for incompatibility, the result is that the free will principle is false. Nobody ever acts freely. And claim B, people are never morally responsible for their actions. And this comes from, again, the presupposition that you're morally responsible for doing something only if you acted freely, so that if nobody ever acts freely, nobody's really morally responsible for their actions. Okay, and there are people in the history of philosophy, if you ever want to search anyone, Paul Holbach, Baron Holbach is one of them, and that's Holbach, a French philosopher named Paul Rée, R-E-E, and there are some contemporary philosophers who hold versions of this theory, hard determinism. It's not the common sense view, I'm guessing. I'm guessing most people on the street, so to speak, would not say that nobody ever acts freely and that we're never morally responsible for our actions. So let's think about whether this might be an acceptable view. And by the way, I guess this theory is going to kind of solve that free will problem by just denying the very first assumption that we are morally responsible agents. Okay, and as a result of if we're not morally responsible agents, there's no need to kind of try to reconcile that with indeterminism, with determinism or indeterminism. Okay, I am going to finish up with a little bit of a dialectic involving some challenges or objections to hard determinism, and how the hard determinists typically respond to such objections, and then a little preview of what's to come. Okay, so the first challenge to hard determinism has to do with doing what we choose. And the challenger might say something like this: we sometimes do what we choose or want to do. Doesn't this prove that we sometimes act freely? I'll give you an example. If you are one of my students watching this video, you probably chose to watch it, right? You chose to click on a certain link or find my channel on YouTube or what have you. I don't know what you had for breakfast or lunch today, but whatever you had, you probably chose to have it, and then you had it, right? We sometimes do what we choose or want to do. Every time you've ever made a choice and acted on that choice kind of proves that the challenger is right here. Doesn't it also prove that we sometimes act freely? Well, the hard determinist is going to say no. The hard determinist is going to say, I agree that we make choices and act on them, but we're caused to choose and want as we do. So the idea is, sure, you chose to click on the link to this video, but the hard determinist is going to say you were caused to choose to click on that link, right? In some sense, your choice was a mental action just as much as your actual clicking was a physical action, and that mental action also was caused by prior events, and in a sense, you could not have chosen otherwise. So the fact that we sometimes do what we choose proves nothing. It doesn't prove that we have the kind of control over our action, the ability to do something else that the challenger thought that it had. In some sense, the hard determinist is saying here, yes, we make choices, but this does not mean that we have choices in the sense of having different options, each one of which we could pursue. I'll let you think about whether you think the hard determinist is making a sensible response to the challenger here. By the way, if we wanted to, we could cast the challenge here as an argument against hard determinism. The first premise might be we sometimes do what we choose. The second premise might be, well, if that, then we act freely. And third, if we act freely, then hard determinism is false. And the hard determinist is going to say that the second premise of such an argument would be false. It's not true that if we do what we choose to do sometimes, then we act freely, for the very reason that we are caused to choose what we choose. Here's another challenge. It comes from the thought that people often resist their passions or their drives to act in certain ways. So the challenger is going to say that we sometimes resist our drives or passions, which are trying to cause us to act in a certain way. So if you have a real, drive to eat that second Pop-Tart, you might resist and say, I'm going to save that for later. Or if you have a real drive to, binge watch something for hours on end, but you watch only one episode, you resist that drive, okay? We often do this. Doesn't that prove that we sometimes act freely, or aren't we overcoming the possible causes of our action? The hard determinist says, nope. The hard determinist says, I agree, we resist our drive sometimes, but the resistance has its own causes. So the fact that we resist our drives proves nothing. We might resist our drive because we have other drives, other desires, and these other desires cause the resistance on the occasions when we resist our drives to act in that way. So the hard determinist has a kind of pretty clear response to this challenge. Two more. Here's a third one. This has to do with something called the phenomenology of freedom, or the feeling of freedom. Okay. Think about whenever you've had sort of a decision, when we're deciding what to do. Don't you feel free? Don't you feel that it's within your power to do any one of several possible things? So when we're deciding what to do, we feel free. We don't feel caused to do what we end up doing, and according to the challenger, this proves that we sometimes act freely. A place to put this in context is sort of maybe almost a trivial example, but imagine that you're like looking at a menu, right? You're looking at a menu, online menu, perhaps, and you're deciding what you'd like to order, okay? You have this feeling that you could order, pretty much anything on that menu. We have this feeling of freedom. And when we decide what to order, we have this feeling that we kind of could have acted otherwise, and that it was under our control what we did. The hard determinist says, no, you're essentially missing the causes that are making you decide in the way you ended up deciding. So the fact that you can't consciously identify the cause of your action doesn't show that there is no cause. And the fact that we don't feel cause proves nothing. So what the hard determinist is saying here is that the challenger here is making a certain error. The error is inferring the fact that there are no causes to our action from the fact that we cannot identify any causes to our action. And the hard determinist is saying, no, just because you can't consciously identify the cause of your action doesn't show that there is none. The causes might be unconscious, or they might proceed too quickly to be consciously introspectable on all of these occasions. So the hard determinist is going to say, yep, whatever you chose on that menu, you were caused to make that choice, and the fact that you felt free is sort of an illusion. Finally, our final challenge has to do with moral responsibility. And by the way, let's see. in the free will and moral responsibility article, there's a little section on hard determinism where you could take a look, and the free will and free choice section, there's another, see, kind of incompatibilism, hard determinism. I'm not making these words up here. We could check that out too. Okay, so the challenger says here, focusing on that first example that we started with, that Hilda was morally responsible for taking that cash. And Hitler, Adolf Hitler, was morally responsible for the murder of Jews and other people. This must prove that they acted freely. Right? How could you act freely? How could you not act freely if you were morally responsible for doing something? If you didn't act freely, you couldn't be morally responsible for what you did. So if Hilda was morally responsible, she must have acted freely. And the hard determinist is in a very difficult predicament here. The hard determinist, I think, really has to say this. We've got to get used to the idea that nobody is really responsible for anything. We simply don't act freely, and as a result, we cannot be morally responsible for our acts. Maybe there's another way to go here, but this is probably the way that hard determinists really have to go. We hold people responsible. We think they're responsible. The law maybe takes them to be responsible. Courts, criminal courts might take people, but metaphysically, nobody is really genuinely blameworthy for what they did. Everything that everybody does is the necessary result of their genetic endowment and the environment in which they found themselves. We got to get used to it. So the idea here is, yes, we have this compulsion to blame people, especially, but really, according to hard determinists, nobody is really morally responsible for anything. Most people kind of can't live with that, and as a result, want to find a theoretical alternative to hard determinism, which is what I'm going to talk about, various ones, in the next video. So here's a little summary and a preview of what we're going to do next time. If the free will principle and determinism are, if they're not compatible, we gotta reject one in order to accept the other, right? So hard determinists reject the free will principle in order to accept determinism. But again, it kind of seems like a last resort, especially with this moral responsibility challenge. So we're going to consider some other possible perspectives. One thing to do that's natural is to make the opposite move. We might reject determinism to accept the free will principle, and that's sort of the very first next move that we're going to make. But it's not the only one in this video that I'm going to show you next time on theories that accept free will or the free will principle.